Hello and welcome to this lecture. Right now I'm on Söderåsen, and the original part of this lecture there was a sort of a failure in filming, so now I'm back at another time of the year. Söderåsen, many people, many students perhaps, if you hear Söderåsen, you would be thinking of Söderåsen's National Park. But I'm not there. I'm someplace else. I'm at Klöveröds rekreationsområde, but that's also on Söderåsen. But where is Söderåsen and what is that? Söderåsen is in Skåne, and here we see a map of Skåne. But this is a political map, which primarily shows us the boundaries of the municipalities. And in English, when we speak of municipalities in Sweden, in Swedish we're talking about kommuner. So I think we need another map. So now we have another map, which is more of a physical map, which almost shows us something that's approaching geology. We see a pattern stretching from the northwest to the southeast in Skåne of forested areas, in some places at least. Söderåsen is a horst, and we can see a number of these features in Skåne. And I'll tell you what a horst is in a moment. This picture is in Swedish. What we see is that the elevated areas, the areas which have risen or been pushed up as relative to the rest of the land, these are referred to in terms of geology in English as horst. And the areas that have subsided or sunk or otherwise are lower relative to other places are called graben. Where the horst and graben meet, where they move in relation to each other, is referred to as a fault. Let's look at another map. Now we seem to be able to more clearly see the geology of the area, or at least some of the geological features. This is a topographical map showing Skåne in the middle and other parts of Sweden, but also of Denmark nearby. The very light blue areas are not water. These are the lowest areas, those that are the closest to sea level. Then we can see green and yellow as the elevation increases. And then we come to the red areas, and finally these sort of gray areas. Those are the highest elevations in the map. There might be some locations which are below sea level. That would be the area around Kristianstad and Aarhus, of course. So this shows us much better the geography of the area. But where is Söderåsen? Here we can see Söderåsen, Hallandsåsen, Linneredsåsen, Romelaåsen. There are more, and the same sort of geological feature may have different names in different parts of this feature. So now that we know a bit about the geology and history of Söderåsen, one of these geological and geographic features in the middle of Skåne, I think it's time for us to move on to the main part of the lecture after being sidetracked. Here I'm going to introduce you to nature protection, why we might want to protect nature, and then we will move on to the IUCN system of naming the different kinds or types of nature protection in this classification system they have. At the very end of this first lecture, I will explain why this lecture is in English in a program of environmental studies in Sweden, where most of the program is in Swedish, although there are some courses in English. So what is nature? Why would we want to protect nature? Perhaps it seems obvious to you, but the answer to that question sometimes is varied in different places at different times in history. What we consider to be nature could be seen as something which is subjective. Our ideas about nature are formed, at least in part, when we are younger, during formative years. when we are a child, when we are a teenager, when we are a young adult. This isn't always the case. Sometimes people later in life get new ideas about nature and have a greater appreciation for nature, but generally speaking, these formative years are very important. If you don't care about nature, if you don't have positive nature experiences up until some point in time there, you probably aren't going to change all that much later in life, with some exceptions. This formation takes place in a context. You have adults, perhaps your parents, who are taking care of you as you're getting older. You have siblings, they may be older than you, they may have friends. There are other adults in your surroundings that you meet on a regular basis or semi-regular basis. They could be grandparents, for example. The formation also takes place in a particular location and a particular place in history. How a typical Swedish family thought about nature in, say, 1922 was probably, and is probably quite different than in 2022. In the same way, how a typical family in another part of the world in the year 2025 looks at nature is probably quite different than how another family in that particular location in 1825 looked at nature. History matters. The context with which your small social group, when you get older, exists in is also important. We also have experience with nature in our formative years. Many of us have had positive experiences being in nature. Here I am right now. But not all of us have had the same experiences. Some people have a very poor experience of nature, hardly any experience at all as they get older. And maybe the nature is very contrived, not very wild. Maybe it's not much more than a glorified park of some kind. We also can see circumstances where in some families, in some situations, the politics which is talked about does not include the environment, where the environment is considered to be relatively unimportant. Probably that means it's not important to be in nature when the adults, the parents, are thinking about the upbringing of their children. It's also possible that there was just no financial possibility for that. Your parents and siblings, how they view things, influence how you also come to view things. Then, of course, there are those, as they get older, that they, so in some ways, rebel against their parents. They take a different path. They think that their parents didn't really know certain things, and it was important for me to find my own way, my own new path. And the environment and nature could be parts of that. That could be, in fact, why some of you are in this program, because you found nature somehow along the way and did not have the socialization process that some of your classmates had. Think about the sum total of people your age, be it 20, 25, 30, 35, whatever age it is, and the way these people think about nature, the environment, and what is worth protecting. Surely some of the positive thoughts via a political system find their way into decisions made in politics and legal decisions. At least that's what we would hope in a democracy that would occur. And so this would mean that we would have environmental laws and areas set aside for nature protection. Well, if more and more people are not experiencing nature and are not placing enough value on it, then this means, of course, and if they're not putting value on that, then this means, of course, they are not sending signals to the political system within political parties and between political parties and at the various levels of the political system that nature is important, that the environment is important. And so not only is there a lack of inputs into the political system, the general population's interest in the environment and understanding of values in nature will start to falter. There'll be less respect for nature. There'll be less money set aside to protect areas that need protection. Unfortunately. Who speaks for nature? There are various kinds of interest groups which speak for different groups of people in society. And there are business groups which try to advance business interests, and labor unions, the workers, and so forth. But who speaks for nature? Well, there are environmental organizations. But the moment politicians don't think that these environmental organizations are so important anymore because membership is falling, because there isn't an interest on the part of people, the general population, well, then most political parties will care less about the environment, and environmental protection will be reduced. I might view something as being nature, which you might not view. And likewise, on the other hand, you might think that something is nature, or you, and I'll think, no, that's not nature at all. How we experience nature is subjective. Someone who has been almost all their life, all the time in a city, and comes to a large park in the outskirts of the city where it's relatively quiet, may consider this to be nature, whereas somebody who's relatively new to the city and has not lived in urban areas as much would just find this to be a nice park and definitely not nature. So it's important that we don't ridicule people who don't have the same kind of nature experiences that we have. The experiences of your classmates having to do with nature are not uniform. There are differences. If you live in Malmö, and particularly if you were originally from Malmö and grew up in Malmö, in all likelihood, at least some point in time, you were in Torup, which is in a municipality outside of Malmö, and the city of Malmö at one point in time purchased this land for city dwellers to be able to go to and have an experience in nature. It certainly is quieter in Malmö, and the landscapes are very picturesque. That's good. Some people might view this as nature. However, we can still see the human impact in the landscape. There are buildings. We can see the agricultural land is taking care of farmers. We can see that in some sense it is a natural landscape, but it is also a cultural landscape. It is what I might refer to as a pastoral landscape. And what do I mean by that? When I speak of a pastoral landscape, a mixture of a cultural landscape and a natural landscape, I mean primarily that there is some sort of agricultural landscape which is predominant, even if there are wooded areas in the landscape. We see plants being cultivated. We see animals. Maybe we don't see them. They could be in various farming buildings. But if we do see them, they are fenced in, and they are being productive in their own way. We see the older buildings. We see the woods. We see the flowing water, the small ponds, and so forth, and that perhaps even the flowing water looks like it is taking a natural course and not has been straightened out during the 1800s by humans in the area. We also see and hear the occasional car driving by on the road, sometimes maybe a bit faster than we'd like. Whether it is nature or not is up to debate. It certainly is a place for recreation and relaxation, primarily of people who live in the city of Malmö. But is it nature? Your recovery from the stress of modern life, your exercise and so forth, it doesn't really matter in some ways if this is real nature or not. Because it's your experiences which is important, and me talking somewhat negatively about Torup might reduce your experiences. Sorry. Please keep going back if you enjoy being there, and it is helpful for you and helps you understand and appreciate nature. However, I would still suggest that Torup is as much cultural as a natural landscape. And true nature, if it exists in that area, are sort of isolated pockets in this agricultural landscape, which has been in part conserved and preserved, and in part has been transformed and helping in the relaxation and recreational process. Now, if you live in Lund, like I do, you probably don't go to Torup all that often. You probably go to Skillegården instead, which is located to the east of the city of Lund, within the municipality of Lund, between Söderåsen and between Dalby. I would like to suggest that Skillegården does a much better job of faking nature than Torup does. Sure, when you arrive at the main entrance to Skillegården, the recreational area, there are lots of people there. There's a restaurant, there is an indoor gym. Why would people get in a car, drive lots of kilometers, and then exercise indoors? Anyway, takes all kind of people, I suppose. There is a so-called Naturum, or it's being refurbished, a sort of a nature visitors center, run often or connected to the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. So in that place, in the entrance, it doesn't feel all that much like nature. But if you've gone a few kilometers into the area, and as the paths become muddier, and as they become narrower, and you are starting not to see or hear any people, you can really relax and get a sense that you are definitely in nature. However, if you have a critical eye, and you're not just there for relaxation, you might start to look at the rows of the trees and say to yourself, maybe somebody planted these trees here 30 or 40 years ago. So is that nature? Even in an area which I suggest does a better job of faking nature than Torup does. I'd like to open up this presentation to include the concept of wilderness. And what is meant by wilderness, and how is wilderness related to nature? Is wilderness and nature the same thing or not? Could it be that nature can be stretched as a concept to include the fake nature of Torup and Skillegården, all the way to nature preserves far away from cities that have few visitors and beyond? And then this beyond are what we would refer to as wilderness. Places where there may be protection, legal protection, or maybe not, but there certainly are extremely few people, if any at all. When we are in wilderness, it's a very big place, and we humans are small and fragile in a potentially dangerous ecosystem for us. We may have our clever gadgets, but they quickly provide us with nothing. They become worse than useless. They become a reminder of something that is not helpful in any way. So if you have an accident when you are in wilderness, you're on your own. There's no cell phone coverage. There's no emergency rescue helicopter which is going to come and save you. If wilderness is something which is set aside, where humans are just guests of nature, and that the rules and the nice organization that we can see in national parks and nature preserves, or at least some of them, like what we see in Sweden, well, there is nothing. There is no human infrastructure in wilderness. We are on our own. And if we are a city dweller with extremely little experience of being in nature and armed with very inappropriate gear, then it won't take long before we succumb. And then we become part of the material and energy flows in that area of wilderness. Could it be that several hundred years ago that there was a lot more nature and there was a lot more wilderness, but greater human populations, more understanding and application of understanding in natural science, and lots of clever technology plus some brute force has led to humans becoming the dominant species on the planet? maybe. We shouldn't have too much hubris. We still might not be the dominant species on the planet. If some genetic combination in some bacteria or some viruses get the better of us. Anyway, the space for wilderness has contracted as expansion and exploitation has continued. We have encroached upon nature, turning flows of material and energies that were once local and self-supporting and turning them to our use, to human use, for our benefit. Places that were once wilderness become some sort of partially tamed nature, whereas other wilderness areas perhaps retain wilderness qualities and characteristics. Our dominance is now so strong that it's very hard to find things that could be considered true nature anymore. I've sort of skirting around the term, what is meant by that. Very little wilderness is left, and in this situation, perhaps our understanding of what nature is and wilderness is has also changed. As society is increasingly urbanized, we spend time in nature as an exception in our existence. Most of the time, most of us are not anywhere near nature, and sometimes we are there for part of a day, for a weekend, and perhaps for some people, a week or two, if they have the luxury of being able to experience that. So with less and less nature, fewer and fewer people in nature, although perhaps some people during the pandemic with little experience were in nature of some sort, seems to happen is that our understanding as individuals, on the part of an average individual, and our understanding on the part of society has become poor. So perhaps we have two kinds of nature now. One that is a domesticated nature, and one that is wilderness, with the latter being increasingly rare. In the former case, sometimes we are fooled into thinking that we are seeing a natural ecosystem, when we in fact are seeing an ecosystem heavily influenced by man, but with lots of vegetation and it being quiet, and animals climbing in trees and flying in the air and swimming in the water. Human activities are now so global and ubiquitous, I'm sure that there are measurable quantities of microplastics in many animals that have never left a wilderness. So in that sense, there is no nature left. That sounds very pessimistic. Sorry about that. I hope my pessimism doesn't stop you from continuing the environmental studies program. Of course, on the other hand, there are examples where humans have let go, so to speak. Agricultural land which was marginal, where it was very difficult to get a profit with grazing cattle or growing crops, sometimes this land is abandoned, and it is perhaps sort of on the edge, far from an urban area and where most people are. And then it is possible for nature to reclaim the fields and the pasture and maybe the managed forest. If the location is remote enough and seldom visited by humans, then some sort of nature returns. There is a space and place where the individuals in various species that are not humans begin to take control of the materials and the energy that is existing in that particular area. We get a greater diversity in the various kinds of in the various species. We get a greater diversity of genes and the gene pool within a species, and we get a greater diversity in the ages of individuals within a particular species. In a tree preservation plantation, of course, most of the trees are planted at the same time and are in the same species, because we want them to grow and be as close as possible to each other without causing a problem to their growth, so that we can cut them all down in 30 years or 50 years' time and make furniture or paper or whatever it is out of it. That's why in nature there's a greater diversity of ages of various kinds of individuals within a species. Given sufficient time, probably everyone, even all of your teachers in the environmental studies program, would probably agree that in this location where nature is reclaiming, that yes, it is nature. The few cultural artifacts that are left over, like a stone wall, are increasingly covered by moss and grass and wildflowers, and perhaps a tree is even growing out of some of that. And given enough time and absence of humans, perhaps we could even start to call this location as being wild and not recently being a tamed kind of nature. But why would we want to protect nature? Why do we do that? Why and when did nature protection arise as an idea? Well, we can say it arose in the 1800s. I'm being very simple here because there were people who had ideas about protecting nature and carried out some rewilding projects in the past, in hundreds of years before that, but these were extremely isolated kinds of instances where perhaps one of the reasons was because that the humans on a remote island or in a particular location were suffering, and so we needed to restore nature so that we were improving the human condition. I will ignore all of that. If I brought up all of that, we'd have to be sitting here for an extra hour, and I don't want to do that. So for simplification, the idea of nature protection arose in the late 1800s and began to spread to various locations around the world in the 1800s and into the 1900s. Why should we protect nature? Basically, this is for essentially one of two answers. Number one, we protect nature for humans and society. For one or more reasons, we protect nature and we consider nature to be valuable for us in society. Why? There might be some natural occurring substances that need to be protected. There might be a particular plant or animal or fungi that can only survive in a particular location, and this living organism produces something that is useful for medical purposes. And it is, so far, impossible for us to synthesize the substance in an industrial process. Or we might need nature or something like it for recreation, and for the idea of carrying out recreational activities, we set aside some area of nature. We use, and recreation could also mean recovery from stress. It doesn't necessarily have to be very active physical activities. It could also be whatever, iron ore, fish, lithium, timber, whatever. That there is a resource that humans need, and the only way we can get that resource is to protect nature. The second answer is that we protect nature for itself or for herself, because nature in English is usually thought of as her. We either believe, suspect, or know that nature has rights, that nature has value, and we need to respect that. Nature and or various parts of an ecosystem and or individuals in particular species, such as animals and plants, we consider or we know that they have ethical standing, regardless of our own wants, our own needs in society. Ethics can be expanded from society to nature. We as a society have a responsibility, and we as ecological citizens have a duty to ensure that the value and rights of all kinds of living things are upheld and have the possibility to grow in an environment which is suitable for those species and so forth. Here, in answer number 2, nature protection is based on the intrinsic rights of non-humans. These non-humans have values regardless of what society otherwise wants or needs. On the other hand, if our answer is number 1, we protect nature for humans and society, nature is given a value by us. It has an instrumental value and a value for us. In a moment, it's time to talk about the IUCN, and for that we're going to change places.
The IUCN is one of a number of international organizations. We're all familiar with the United Nations system, but the IUCN is not formally part of the UN. There are other important international organizations that you might need to know the abbreviations for and what they are, not only as part of an environmental studies program, but also part of your general knowledge in your preparation for working with environmental questions outside the course. Oh, now I'm digressing again. Another example is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which again is not formally part of the UN, but has some sort of linkages to it. Let's say something more. Let me say something more about the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Most of the general public has never heard of this organization, and you perhaps have not heard of it before today, or at least very recently. They have a number of coordinating activities, and they initiate certain things under the umbrella of the conservation of nature. So they try to link together various international attempts into one having to do with nature conservation. So there might be a coordination of research in a particular place, like tropical rainforests for a few years. Anyway, one of the things that the IUCN has done is that they have established what is referred to as the Protected Area Management Categories. It's a system to classify protected areas of nature according to one of 7 different kinds of levels of protection, where the highest level, the 1A and 1B, afford the most amount of protection for nature, and the lowest level has the least amount of protection of nature, approximately. And one of the reasons why the IUCN has established this classification system is that different countries will sometimes say that they have a nature preserve, a national forest, a national park, and so forth. And we might think, oh, when they say national park, it means this. But the IUCN says, but wait a minute, what is called a, say, national park in one country may not have as much nature protection as a national park in another country. So to sort of create order out of all of these different kinds of national systems, they established this protected area management category system. For example, what is called a national park in England, generally speaking, has a lower level of environmental or nature protection than what is called a national park in Sweden. So we can't really compare the two, although they may have a similar kind of name. Now, in the same way that we have biological names, where we have botanical names, for example, and Linné began describing plants and flowers, of course, plants, into some sort of a system and establishing that there were certain species that were more related to others. And then it doesn't matter what we locally call something. If we know the scientific name, then we can know what we're talking about. That's at least the idea, that each species has one name and one name only in science. So let's take an example of a primarily nowadays domesticated kind of species, Triticum aestivum, which is wheat in English, or in Swedish you would say vete. So it doesn't matter where in the world you are, different names in different languages for wheat, you have the specific Triticum aestivum as the name for wheat overall the whole entire world. And again, it's like the IUCN is attempting to establish some sort of order. It doesn't matter the formal names in each country and the environmental laws. There are certain criteria the IUCN has, and then we can see whether this protected area fulfills what level of protection the IUCN has. And in fact, if you go to Wikipedia, and note you have to go to the English language Wikipedia, not the Swedish language Wikipedia, and you can type in a variety of national parks, and you will see that many of them have their IUCN classification number. They generally are on the right side of the page that you're looking at. I was going to do that. That would have been wrong. So, if we look at the western United States, a national park like Yosemite National Park, in a sense one of the first national parks, but in a sense not. But anyway, it is considered by the IUCN to be a Category 2, which is a national park. Whereas if you go to Cairngorms National Park in Scotland, part of the United Kingdom, it's a national park according to legislation in that country, but the IUCN says, no, that's not. It's a level 5, a protected landscape seascape. But wait a minute, I think we need that list back to look at it. So, continuing in my script, let's look at these categories. So we have our list now. The IUCN Protected Area Management categories. We have Strict Nature Reserve, 1A, 1B, Wilderness Area, 2, National Park, 3, National Monument or Feature, 4, Habitat or Species Management Area, 5, Protected Landscape Seascape, and 6, Protected Area with Sustainable Use of Natural Resources. You'll just have to accept that they're Roman numerals, that VI means 6. What can we say about this? I'm not going to mention all of these here, but if we look at 1A and 1B, Strict Nature Reserve and Wilderness Area, when it comes to these, in some countries you may require specific written permission to be able to enter that particular area. The general public is not allowed there. Even those that want to carry out some sort of scientific investigation and spend a few days in the area may be required to get permission from some sort of warden to be able to enter the area. There are no fences, perhaps, keeping people out. So this means that these areas are quite set aside and nature can run its course. When we come to Category 2, National Park, the general public in Sweden would be thinking that this is the highest level of nature protection that exists in Sweden. And this is what we're, of course, most familiar with. Countries can be proud about their national park, but this is a place which is designed for humans to come to. It is a park, of course. Now, there could be restrictions on how many people can be in the park and what they can do there. In general, if we look at, say, a Swedish national park, the roads end on the edge of the national park, but if you go to some national parks in the United States, for example, there may be roads going right to the park. From a Swedish perspective, that sounds a little questionable. There are, of course, roads that go in some national parks in Sweden anyway, but that's another point. So we want to, we either want to actively limit the number of people who come to the national park, or we maybe want them to go to only particular areas and other places they are less likely to go to. Category 3, National Monument or Feature, and Category 5, Habitat Species Management Area. We could think of, in Sweden, a naturreservat would be something that would fall very close to number 3. And there might be very specific places that you want to manage to make sure that the habitats are maintained or that specific species have a living environment, a habitat that they can survive in. And sometimes that's written into the decisions about a nature preserve, naturreservat, what needs to be saved and protected and so on. Then we have protected landscape and seascape and protected area with sustainable use of natural resources. When it comes to our final lecture, the third installment in this series, will be coming back to number 6 in relation to a particular country. But for now, that's I think what you need to know about the IUCN, what the abbreviation means. Think about the exam, and that they have a system of protected area management categories, but you don't need to know the list, but you just sort of have a sense that these categories exist. If you find this interesting and you'd like to learn more about it, be my guest. But you don't need to know anything more about this for an exam or for this course. There might be something that you would want to know in coming courses, and that you would take responsibility for that yourself. So we're reaching the end of this first installment having to do with nature protection, and as I promised in the beginning, I would discuss why this language, why this lecture is in English. So, why? This is based in part on many years, maybe as many as 15 years, of teaching in the environmental studies program at Malmö University. So, we have some reasons. Let's move over to the side here. One, there are students that want me to lecture in English. They don't want me to lecture in English all the time, but they want me to lecture in English at least sometimes. You can ask former students why, and you can compare that to the reasons you might realize at some point in the program why. Reason number 2, preparations for guests. Occasionally, we have guest lecturers that come from other countries. They are here at Malmö University for shorter or longer periods of time, and as part of the deal of being at the department, with getting office space and everything like that, then they hold, as a courtesy, a number of lectures or seminars in various kinds of programs, educational programs at the bachelor's or master's level. And unless they're from Norway, Denmark, or Swedish-speaking people from Finland, they're probably going to hold their lecture in English. So this means a preparation for you and everyone else in your class in case we have some guest or guests during the time that you're in the program holding a lecture in English. Reason number 3, as you know already, when you applied for the program in environmental studies, some of our courses are in English. This is one of the reasons for this is that, of course, you are in a Swedish university, but you're also in an international sort of context. Universities, by and large, in most countries, also see themselves as a part of an international community. So think of this lecture as a preparation for some of the courses that you will be taking, where there will be lectures in English and not just literature in English. And there could be international students that are taking part in the course. Why do we have courses in English for international students? Most international students don't know Swedish well enough, so they come here. We have international agreements. We have agreements with other universities to send and receive students. If we don't receive any students, we can't send any. If we send students, we have to receive them. So educational programs at the bachelor's level, field can, that want to be able to send students also have to be able to receive students. So we have to be able to hold some courses in English. Reason number 4, competence, knowledge, and skills. It would be to your advantage to know terms in both Swedish and English. You never know when you might need to be able to explain something in English as opposed to in Swedish. And if you've never used the term, then you're going to have a problem. You may have heard it, but you've never used it. You've never thought about it. So that could be a bit of a problem for you. Related to this is point number 5, the future. I'm going to tell you a little story. A former student in our program, years and years and years ago, not 20 years ago, but a long time ago, he was complaining in the last year of the program, as some students do in the beginning of the program. He was complaining about, oh, all these things in English. I'm never going to have to use any English. I'm going to work for X or Y or Z, and it's a Swedish organization, and there won't be any problem. Okay, no names mentioned here to protect the innocent or the guilty in this case. But we can think of this example that I'm going to bring up here. Suppose you have the same idea that this former student had. I'm going to work for a Swedish company, and I'm going to be the environmental coordinator, environmental manager for that Swedish company, and I don't really need to know all that much English, other than that we get some materials sometimes in English, like that. But just suppose for a moment that the company that you work in for a few years gets bought by a German company. And the Germans don't expect the Swedes to be able to speak German, and the Swedes hope that they won't be expected to that. And the German owners of the company say now, okay, our language and our concern will be English. Of course, internally we can have various kinds of things in German and Swedish, but we'll use English because that would be neutral. We Germans aren't perfect in English, and we think you Swedes might not be perfect in English either. So the German company has an environmental manager, and the Swedish company has an environmental manager. Who's going to get the top job? Well, whoever's English is better is going to get the top job. And if you think English isn't important, but this person in the other country thinks it is, so English is important. So what happened to this guy who was in one of the first years of the environmental studies program in this department, in this university? Well, he worked for a largest municipality in Skåne, no names mentioned which one, and he worked there for a few years, probably mostly in Swedish. And then it turned out that that municipality was going to play host to a European conference having to do with mobility and public transportation and bicycles and sustainable development and so forth. So do you think the language of the conference was going to be in Swedish? No, it was going to be in English. And suddenly this person was dealing with preparations in English in a way that this person had never anticipated it would be. And then we had, and I participated in some of this conference. There were like 150 people there. There were only, besides people from Sweden, and of course the language was in English, and there were people from France and Spain and Germany. And what were they speaking? English. The French maybe begrudgingly speak English, but they were speaking English. So you may have at this moment a sort of small, narrow world, thinking Swedish and so forth. But we can see obviously that it would be to your advantage to have some sort of competence and skills using English and terminology and concepts and tools in English, not just Swedish. It is to your advantage, and it's good to start during this particular program. I can also say that this person that I mentioned before working in a municipality, sometimes since a municipality is part of an EU country, and you have to, when you want to have a company do something for the municipality and it's over a certain amount, then there's what is referred to as in Swedish lagen om offentlig upphandling, and sometimes you have to announce at the EU level, would somebody like to make a bid to be able to do something for us? And if you have an international construction company with a consortia and there's sort of environmental impact assessment that's going to be made and so forth and so on, so you get the picture. You can lose out in your career if you ignore English. So, thank you for bearing with me in this lecture, and I hope you found it interesting, educational, food for thought, and perhaps even slightly entertaining.